Welcome to the shop. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I'm going to be putting together this awesome looking sword from Raya and the Last Dragon. Now when I saw the trailer for this movie, I knew I had to build this particular sword because number one, it looks really cool, and number two, I knew that it would be a challenge. Now in this video you're going to see me use a lot of different power tools and equipment that you may not have, but it's not a necessity to assemble this particular sword. I just happen to have them in my shop and it helps me move through builds faster so I can bring you more videos. Now this particular sword is of course made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials. I want to show you what it takes to put it together, so let's go ahead and get started. Just like a bunch of my other build videos, a free PDF template for this sword can be found on my website. There is a link over in the description section. I'm going to start off by fabricating the handle, and to do that I'm going to be using a 1/2-inch PVC pipe. This is cut down on my bandsaw, and then a sanding sponge is used to get rid of any plastic burrs. This is so I can use a coupler to attach the handle to the blade, which will allow me to break this weapon down and make it easier for transportation. The ornate guard template is cut away from the top of the handle, and the PVC pipe is sanded smooth before being marked. This is so I know how much foam to wrap around the PVC pipe. I'm going to be using 2mm HD foam to wrap around the handle and some weldwood contact cement to adhere it. Once the contact cement has become tacky, the pipe is rolled onto the foam and any excess material can be cut away. A smooth sanding drum is used to clean up the seam, and it's not going to be visible later on because we're going to cover it up with details. To fabricate this detail guard, I'm going to be using 3 pieces of 10mm HD foam. Because I have a lot of surface area to cover, I'm going to be using some 3M90 spray adhesive. Just like with contact cement, you wait for the glue to become tacky and then you compress the foam together. In this case, I'm also using a PVC rolling pin. After all 3 pieces of foam have been glued together, I can then trace the template onto it using a pencil. To speed through this process, I take the stacked foam over to my bandsaw to be cut out. And like I had mentioned, if you don't have a bandsaw, it's no problem. You can still cut this out with a utility knife and just refine it with your rotary tool. To create a space for the PVC handle, I use my drill press to make a pilot hole. Afterwards, I switch over to a Forstner bit until I have the correct diameter that the PVC pipe can slide into the guard. Now I can start working on the dragon details on the guard, and the templates for this are traced onto some 4mm HD foam. Making sure to first sharpen my scalpel blade, all these dragon details are then cut out by hand. Using this 4mm foam will give it a layered look and hopefully get pretty close to matching the concept art in the end. Now I can use my rotary tool to start to refine the guard itself, tapering the dragon's heads and rounding over all the edges. This same process is also done to the 4mm dragon details. Using a hot tool, I carve into the foam. Now remember, if you're doing this, to make sure to do it in a well-ventilated area and always wear your respirator. This line gives me a defined area that I can cut into and define the dragon's neck a little bit more. I do a light heat treatment on the foam before using some Bob Smith superglue to adhere both of the 4mm cutouts to the guard. Using my rotary tool, I can now taper and refine the foam even further. To transfer all the detail lines of the dragons onto the foam, I start by pressing through the paper with a straight pen. This method will give me the approximate location of all the details, and then I can use a ballpoint pen to outline all the shapes. Using my heat tool with the detailed tip, I can now trace all the lines that I had drawn on earlier. The heat tool doesn't take any pressure to open the foam up, so be careful because you can scorch the foam more than you intend. Now I can use a small sanding drum to bevel all the lines to give this a 3D sculpted appearance. From the initial transfer of the template of the dragon head, I decided that I was going to make the jaw separate. A strip of 4mm HD foam is sanded down and then tapered on either end. This small piece can then be glued into place to fabricate the lower jaw of the dragon. Now the jaw itself still needs to be refined, so I use a smooth sanding drum to blend it into the head. To build up and detail the neck of the dragon, I'm going to be using foam clay. The process for this is fairly simple. You just wet the HD foam and then apply the foam clay directly to it. Water can be used to smooth it out, and silicone tip tools are great for adding details. While the foam clay dries, I'm going to go back to the details on the dragons. So far I've used the heat tool and a sanding drum to bevel it. Now I'm going to use a scalpel blade to slightly cut it and open it up. So using the score and heat technique, all the lines that I've cut will now open up and be more defined. Now I'm going to move on to the blade, and to give it some stability I'm going to be using a metal rod cut from a yardstake. This rod will go into a piece of PVC that will match the coupler in the handle. To give the rod some stability, I use a piece of 15mm HD foam round down. This is pressed down into the PVC pipe, and then the metal rod can be inserted and glued into place. Here you can see how it will fit into the handle and run up the blade. To create a channel in the foam for the rod to sit in, I use a metal straight edge and a stone bit attached to a wireless Dremel tool. I also use my rotary tool to carve out a larger section for the PVC pipe. The 3M90 high-strength spray adhesive is used again, and once tacky, the rod can be placed into one half. Then the other half can be put on top and pressed down. The template for the blade can then be traced onto the foam with a pencil, and then this is carefully cut out on my bandsaw. Now if I didn't have a bandsaw, I'd rough cut all this with a utility knife and clean it up with a rotary tool. The part at the bottom of the blade that fits next to the guard just needs to be cut by hand because of the PVC pipe, so I use a scalpel blade to remove the material. To give me a guide for the bevels of the blade, I'm using a compass. This tool will give me a uniform distance from the edge to the middle of the blade. Now it's just a simple process of using my rotary tool to remove the foam from the middle of the blade to the line that I've drawn. This will make sure that the bevel is uniform all the way down the side. The first pass is done with a rough sanding drum just to remove a lot of material, and then I go in with a smooth sanding drum to smooth it all out. Now I'm going to go back and fabricate the details that are on the handle. And my thought is to keep the thicknesses uniform. I'm going to be using strips of 2mm and 1mm HD foam. I'm going to start with the parts that are wood, and I'm going to wrap some 2mm foam around the pipe and then trim away any excess. The thinner section that's above this is just achieved by using some 1mm HD foam. I cut a circle by hand to act as a cap for the top of the pipe. Notice that the circle is a little bit wider than the pipe, and that's so that the 4mm foam that I wrap around this has a tapered appearance. Now all the seams down the side can be cleaned up and the top of the handle can be refined. To give my foam that wood look, I'm using a small stone bit to give it some organic striations. Now I can add the metal band in the middle, but before I glue it on, I want to score it a couple of times so I can do the heat technique later on. This will give me some great linear details. I also use my utility knife to do the same score technique to the top of the handle on this wood part. I go back to my template and I cut out the plants that will go on either side. These intricate details are traced onto some 1mm foam and carefully applied to the handle. This same process is applied to the leaves that are on either side of the stem. The middle of this flower is also cut out of 1mm foam and applied to the handle. You can see how this layering technique really gives it a cool look. The rotary tool is used to smooth out the sides to make it look like it's more carved from the handle rather than glued to it. I use a leather punch to create the small detail rivets and glue those into place. My heat gun is now used to open up all the cuts that I had made earlier. With the cuts now visible, I can take a small strip of 1mm foam and wrap it around the metal band. I also wrap 4mm and 6mm strips around the base of the handle to go to the guard. A 2mm strip is placed directly under the 1mm I had added earlier, and then one last strip of 1mm is glued in a wavy line around the band. A scalpel blade attachment on my heat tool is used to make the wavy line on the bottom of the metal section, as well as the small divots along the top. Now these triangle details at the very top, I don't know if it's right or not. I couldn't get a good reference, but I figured it doesn't really matter because most of this gets covered up with a piece of cloth. To smooth out and round over the top of the handle, I'm again using foam clay. After this dries, I'll easily be able to sand it down to the shape I want. To simulate the cloth at the top of the handle, I'm going to be using 1mm HD foam. Now I know Blick does not sell my 1mm, but I still have some in my warehouse, so if you are interested, feel free to hit me up. This foam is tied around the top of the handle, and then super glue is used to keep it in place. The excess can then be trimmed off, and for foam, that's pretty convincing. I'm to the point where I can glue the handle into the guard, and I do that using some Bob Smith super glue. I also glue the coupler on and knock that into place just to make sure it's not going anywhere. Two 10mm and one 4mm foam pieces are stacked together. This is going to make up the piece where the guard meets the blade. I start by cutting the shape into a basic rectangle so it will sit flat. That way I can drill a hole through the middle for the PVC pipe, just like I had done for the guard. Once the hole was complete, the additional material could then be removed with my bandsaw. This piece can then be adhered to the pipe, coupler, and the guard. Since there's a small seam, I fill it with some foam clay just to smooth it out. I press a sharpened pencil through the paper to mark the location for the cuts in the blade. It's important that I put these on now before I add the center ridge just to make sure it all lines up. For the center ridge, I'm going to be using a 10mm HD foam triangle dowel. I know that this probably doesn't taper quite as much as the concept art, but this is a simple solution for a complex problem. This dowel can be glued to the middle of the blade, making sure to match the curve all the way down. When I get to the very end, the dowel is trimmed to a point with some scissors. My rotary tool is used to taper the dowel at the end, and then a light heat treatment is applied to the entire blade. To protect the end of the blade, I'll be doing my super glue technique to help reinforce the foam. The shape that's in the middle of the blade continues onto the guard, and I fabricate that also using the triangle dowel. Notice here how this section is slightly lower than the one that's on the blade, and that's because there's an additional piece that will be glued on top. This detail piece can then be glued to the top of the dowel and then wrapped around to the sides. This small detail piece does a great job with the transition from the handle to the blade. To make this section a little more seamless, foam clay is once again used, and after it dries, it will be sanded down tomorrow. So it's been almost 24 hours and all my foam clay pieces are ready to be sanded. Now foam clay sands very well, so be careful of that because you can take off too much, but I use a combination of sanding sponges, sandpaper, and sanding sticks. I know there's a color difference right now, but once paint and primer are applied, this will be seamless. To simulate all the segmentations in the blade, I start by using my scalpel blade and following the lines that I'd previously drawn. Then it's once again just doing the heat gun and the heat technique to open all these cuts up. To prime and seal my foam, I'm once again going to be using Creature Cast, which is a neoprene rubber. Right out of the jug, it's pretty thin, so I'm going to be adding some Neothix to it just to thicken it up a little bit. Now, Creature Cast can be sprayed through a critter gun or an airbrush, but I like to apply it using a chip brush. The main thing in the beginning here is just to make sure that the Creature Cast gets down into all of the details. On the wood handle section, any place that is starting to build up a little too much, I use some upholstery foam to take it away. I also use the upholstery foam to add a texture to the guard. And like I've said before, with Creature Cast, it's different than Plasti-Dip. This dries almost like an acrylic paint, so the dry time is actually fairly quick. After the first thin layer had dried on the blade, I went back and stippled in a second layer just to give it an additional texture. My first layer of paint is going to be Rust-Oleum Antique Pewter over all of the metal areas. For the wood areas, I'm using Krylon Red Oxide as my base. Now picture to picture, this blade has lots of different variations in color, so I'm going to add some Montana Gold just to break up the silver as well. After the spray paints have been allowed to dry, I can then remove the masking that I had done on the handle. Moving on to the acrylics, we're going to start with some Liquitex Mars Black as a wash for the entire surface. This watered down paint is applied with a 1-inch mop brush, and any additional paint that's left over is mopped up with a damp paper towel. To make it look as though this blade has a patina to it, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Turquoise Green along with some iridescent rich silver. You can see applying this on top of the metallics that I already have down gives it a very oxidized look. Now I can add some highlights, and I'm going to start by using some Utrecht brand Iridescent Gold. This paint is dry brushed over the highlights, making sure not to cover all the colors I already have laid down. Now the gold is underneath to make the silver pop, but I really want silver to be the main color. So I'm going to mix some cobalt teal along with some iridescent silver and a little bit of that iridescent gold together to make my final color. This mixture is dry brushed over almost all of the highlight areas, but you can still see where that gold really shines through in the recesses. This combination of colors gives the prop a lot more depth and is a lot more convincing than just single colors. To make all the cuts and details pop on this piece, I use a liner brush with some watered down Mars Black. This paint allows all those little small details that are in the guard to really pop. This same Mars Black is also applied to the top of the handle and the fabric wrap. Now it's time to work on the wood, and I'm going to start with a mixture of burnt sienna and raw sienna being dry brushed over all the details. After the dry brush had been complete, I can now add some of the metallics to the details on the grip. Mars Black and the liner brush are once again used to add lines to the leaves at the side of the plant. Then a wash is mixed up and applied around the flower just to make it pop a little bit more. After that had dried, raw sienna is applied with a liner brush along the edges as a final highlight. To paint the cloth, I'm going to be using Liquitex Cadmium Red Medium. This is at first mixed with some Mars Black as the base color. And then some straight cadmium red is dry brushed onto the highlights. I do one last cleanup on the metallic pieces using a little bit more of that teal. Now I might have been able to find a teardrop jewel just the size that I needed, but I figured I might as well just go ahead and make it out of foam. The foam jewel was refined with a rotary tool and then glued into the center of the guard. Now since everything else was pretty much done, I decided to prime this with some FX primer. To paint the jewels, I'm going to be using Vallejo brand Night Blue and Magic Blue. These paints are designed for miniatures, so they have a very high pigment quality and they blend really well. Here I'm trying just to outline the facets of the jewel with different types of highlights. This is the type of process where up close it may not look right, but 6 feet away it's going to look great for pictures. Vallejo brand Dead White is also applied to the jewel as a highlight. And to make sure that the jewels have a sheen to them, Vallejo brand Gloss Varnish is applied over the top. so you all can see the steps that I took to put together the sword from Raya and the Last Dragon. Now hopefully you're all getting inspired by these videos and enjoying them, because I would love to see you tackle this build. And remember, if you're building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram, because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.